If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Late afternoon, light hung low over the outskirts of the ruined European village, giving the landscape a flat, cold tone. Smoke drifted from collapsed chimneys, and the shell of a church stood crooked in the distance, its stones blackened by months of artillery fire. The American Ordnance Unit had taken over a muddy stretch near a blown-out farmhouse, turning it into a temporary testing site. Everything looked improvised, tables made from doors, crates stacked on uneven bricks, tarps flapping in the wind. Soldiers moved from one task to another without enthusiasm. Some carried tools. Others dragged damaged equipment into piles. The banned M8 anti-tank rockets sat on a separate pallet near the edge of the yard, rusted, dented, and treated with open disgust. Every man who passed them either swore under his breath or kicked the crate lightly, as if the weapon had personally betrayed him. A supply truck rolled in through the mud, and Lena Hartmann stepped down from the back, tucking a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear as she adjusted her civilian coat. She wore the small white armband that marked her as an authorized interpreter. Her breath came fast from nerves, though she kept her face composed. She scanned the camp, soldiers, equipment, burnt buildings. Everything felt painfully familiar. It reminded her of the night her home had been raided. She forced the memory away, straightened her back, and approached the nearest officer. "Interpreter Hartmann reporting," she said quietly. The lieutenant barely looked at her before pointing toward the command hut. "They'll need you inside. We got German documents coming in all day." Lena nodded and walked across the muddy ground. She kept her arms close to her body. Being German-born among American soldiers always carried a risk. Misunderstandings, suspicion, unwanted glances. She heard two men behind her whisper, "Kraut girl," but the words slid off her like a familiar bruise. She had learned long ago not to react. Inside the hut, she was handed a stack of captured messages to translate. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first paper. It mentioned towns near where her parents had died. The tightness in her chest returned, and she paused long enough to steady her breathing. Her mission here was simple: help the Americans avoid being surprised by German movements. If she did her job well, fewer people would die. That thought kept her moving. Near the far end of the yard, Corporal Elias Ward moved crates of M8 rockets into a line. He looked like he hadn't slept well in days. Dark circles under his eyes, a stiff way of moving, and a constant alertness, as if expecting danger at any moment. Elias lifted a damaged rocket, turning it in his hands. The fuse housing was rusted, the fin warped. He exhaled slowly and set it down. The M8 had failed repeatedly, killed operators, and embarrassed the Ordnance Corps. The Army had banned it 2 weeks earlier. His job now was simple: record serial numbers and prepare them for disposal. But even while working, his thoughts drifted to the friend he'd lost months earlier, Tom Weaver, who burned alive inside a Sherman tank during a German armored assault. Elias had been thrown clear of the wreck, alive only because of where he happened to be standing. That accident gnawed at him daily. The guilt never softened. A sergeant shouted for him, and Elias snapped out of the memory, answering with a quiet "yeah." His mission here was straightforward: support the ordnance team, follow orders, keep his head down, and avoid the front lines where tanks roared in the night. He wasn't ready to face that again. The officers called for a late afternoon briefing in a half-collapsed barn. Soldiers gathered inside, their boots crunching on broken plaster. Lena stood near the back, notebook in hand, ready to translate if needed. Elias stood alone near a stack of crates, arms crossed. The captain held up an M8 rocket. "Official order came down this morning," he said. "These are done. Banned. They'll be scrapped tomorrow and hauled off for disposal." A few soldiers cheered sarcastically. Someone muttered, "Should have banned them a year ago." Elias looked at the weapon with a blank expression, but something in his eyes tightened. He remembered the earlier tests: rockets wobbling off course, fuses failing, fragments shooting sideways. Lena noticed his reaction. Their eyes met for a second. She saw a man carrying heaviness, not arrogance. Elias saw a woman who looked controlled but exhausted deep underneath. When the meeting ended, a corporal barked instructions. Ward, move those rockets behind the barn. Interpreter, Hartman, helped mark the disposal files. Their first exchange was brief and practical. Elias, you need the crate numbers? Lena, yes. If you call them out, I'll record them. They worked side by side. He lifted each rocket with careful hands. She wrote the numbers with neat precision. Neither spoke more than necessary, but the silence between them felt deliberate, not cold. Two people conserving their strength. Lena caught the faint tremble in his fingers when he touched a rocket with a damaged fuse. She realized he wasn't afraid of it. He was remembering something. Elias noticed how she flinched slightly whenever a soldier raised his voice, even if it wasn't directed at her. They did not comment on these things, but they both noticed. The chapter closes with a simple moment. Lena stepped outside the barn, rubbing her hands together against the cold. Elias followed with the last crate. You're fast at this, she said, almost kindly. He shrugged. Been handling this junk for a while. A distant artillery boom echoed across the landscape, and Lena stiffened. Elias looked at her and understood immediately. It wasn't the sound itself, but the memory it triggered. Front's far, he said quietly. Couple miles at least. She nodded, relieved but embarrassed by her reaction. They stood there, two strangers in a broken village, each carrying their own heavy pieces of the war. Neither tried to comfort the other with empty words. Instead, they shared a silent acknowledgement. You're not the only one surviving something. The night settled early over the ruined village, and the temperature dropped fast, leaving the camp wrapped in a damp, sharp cold that seeped into clothing and joints. After the briefing ended, the soldiers returned to their tasks. In the temporary test yard became a patchwork of dim lantern light and long shadows. The smell of wet earth mixed with burned timber lingered in the air. Lena stayed inside the command hut long after most of the men had drifted away. She finished labeling the last file on the M8 disposal list, double-checking every number before she set the stack aside. She worked slowly, trying to keep her hand steady. The presence of the banned rockets still bothered her, not because she feared them, but because objects tied to destruction always triggered the same questions in her mind. How something man-made could be so unpredictable, how easily it could break a life, and how many times she had been the one reading the consequences on casualty reports. Outside, Elias crossed the yard carrying a lantern and a toolkit. His shoulders were tense from hours of lifting crates. He felt the stiffness when he set the kit on an overturned barrel and opened it. A short inventory check was part of his evening routine, something that kept him busy enough not to think too long about the past. Even so, the image of Tom trapped in the burning tank pushed its way into his thoughts every time he handled anything related to explosives. He shook it off and focused on counting fuses, wires, and spare parts. The task was simple, steady, predictable, nothing like the chaos he had lived through at the front. When Lena finally stepped outside the command hut, she saw Elias alone under the lantern's weak light. He looked different in the quiet, less guarded, more worn. She hesitated before approaching him, unsure whether she should interrupt. Her presence still stirred mixed reactions in camp, though the worst of the suspicion had faded. A few men watched her pass, but returned to their work without comment. She took small comfort in that. "You're still working?" she asked as she reached him. "Almost done," he replied, not looking up immediately. "Just checking the tools before the sergeant starts yelling tomorrow." She gave a faint smile. "I think he yells even when everything is perfect." Elias let out a short laugh, a rare sound, and finally lifted his eyes to her. He seemed slightly surprised that she could joke, even lightly. Lena noticed his hesitation and wondered if he thought she was too fragile to handle humor. People often assumed that when they heard her quiet voice or saw the way she avoided loud groups. She looked down at the inventory crate. "I didn't know ordnance work continued this late." He shrugged. "Helps me sleep." His tone told her more than the words. She understood the meaning immediately, avoiding silence, keeping the mind from running back to moments it shouldn't revisit. She knew that routine well. For her, translation offered the same escape. A A sudden question rose in her mind, one she had pushed aside earlier. Why was he transferred here? What exactly had he been through? She sensed an old wound behind his eyes, but she didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, she said, I thought you were frontline. He froze for a moment before answering. Was. They pulled me back after an attack. His voice remained even, but Lena saw the shift. His shoulders tightened, and his jaw locked slightly. This place is supposed to be quieter. She nodded. Quieter doesn't always mean easier. Their silence carried something familiar now. Not awkwardness, but recognition. They were two people who had been pushed into roles they never wanted, trying to make sense of duties that didn't always feel survivable. Before either could say more, a supply officer approached with a folder. Hartmann, need you to look at these reports. Movement from German units nearby. See what's important. Lena took the folder, her expression shifting to focus. Elias noticed how quickly her calm returned when she worked, how the fear that sometimes passed through her eyes disappeared the moment she had a task. Only someone who had lived through real danger could switch like that. When the officer left, Lena exhaled. I should start on this tonight. The sooner command knows, the better. Elias studied her for a moment. Do you ever stop working? Do you? She countered. He shook his head. Fair. She didn't walk back to the hut immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes to the pallet of Band M8 rockets sitting under a tarp near the barn. The faint shape of their rusted tubes stood out even in the dark. She pointed toward them. Why do they fail so often? Do you know? Elias followed her gaze. Bad fuses. Weak welds. Some cases warped from the factory. They're fine on paper, but not in the real world. They miss targets, detonate early, or don't detonate at all. He took a slow breath. Men died because of them. Lena felt a tightening in her stomach. She asked the next question without thinking. And tomorrow they'll just be gone? That's the plan, he said. Safer that way. His answer didn't fully ease the tension she felt. Something about those rockets bothered her. Not fear, but an uneasiness she couldn't explain. Maybe it was because abandoned weapons never truly stayed harmless. The war had taught her that anything made to kill would eventually find its moment. The lantern flickered, and a cold gust swept across the yard. Elias closed his toolkit. You should get inside before the weather gets worse. You too, she said, though she knew he wouldn't. They parted ways. Lena returned to the hut and began translating the documents. She forced herself to focus, but her mind drifted back to Elias, his steady hands, the silence behind his eyes, the story he hadn't fully told. She realized that she wanted to understand him, not out of curiosity, but because she recognized something in him she recognized in herself. A person shaped by survival, trying to find a place where they no longer had a brace for the next loss. Across the yard, Elias remained under the lantern's glow. He checked the last of the equipment before straightening up, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked once more toward the command hut. He didn't know why the interpreter's presence affected him the way it did. She was quiet, careful, clearly carrying something heavy. She reminded him of people who endured too much but never stopped working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant pain. He walked toward the barracks tent, but not before glancing at the barn where the band rockets waited. Something about the way Lena had looked at them unsettled him. He had no reason for it, just a feeling that the M8S, despite being marked for disposal, were not finished with this camp. The chapter closes with the camp settling into uneasy sleep. Soldiers roll into their blankets, lanterns dim, and the wind pushes through broken walls. In the distance, artillery thumps faintly. Lena continues translating until her eyes blur. Elias lies awake, staring at the dark canvas of the tent ceiling, listening for any sound that might signal danger. Both of them feel the same unspoken truth. The war is moving, shifting, gathering force somewhere out of sight. And neither of them knows that the rusted, unwanted M8 rocket, ignored by everyone, will be the only thing standing between life and death soon enough. Before dawn, a pale gray light crept over the ruined village, revealing the shape of collapsed roofs and broken walls under a thin layer of frost. The camp stirred slowly, soldiers pulling on boots and jackets with dull movements shaped by exhaustion. A cook lit the field stove, producing a faint glow and weak heat that barely pushed against the cold. The testing yard still held the same clutter of crates, tools, and damaged equipment from the night before, but there was an uneasiness in the air that hadn't been there during previous mornings. Lena stepped out of the command hut, clutching her translation notes. She had barely slept. The intercepted German reports had suggested increased retreat activity in nearby woods. Nothing confirmed, nothing specific, but enough to keep her awake. She knew better than to bring it up without solid proof, but the worry lingered. As she crossed the yard, she searched for Elias almost instinctively, her eyes scanning for the familiar shape of his uniform. He appeared from behind the barn, carrying a toolbox, his breath visible in the cold. He gave her a small nod. She hesitated, then walked toward him. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, noticing the faint circles under her eyes. "Neither did you," she replied. He didn't deny it. "Any news from those documents last night?" "Just scattered orders. Retreating units. Nothing suggesting armor this close." She paused, tightening her grip on the papers. "But some notes mentioned shortages. When German units panic or run short on fuel, they move unpredictably." Elias heard something in her tone that made him pay attention. She wasn't simply reporting information. She was warning him quietly, carefully, without raising alarm. Before he could ask more, a sergeant shouted orders for the morning work, clearing debris, packing tools, marking crates for pickup. The unit was preparing to relocate soon, and everyone worked faster than usual. Elias headed toward the pallet of banned rockets, and Lena followed, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the same direction. The M8 rocket sat under their tarp exactly as before, forgotten, ridiculed, dismissed. Lena stopped a few feet away and studied them with attention she didn't fully understand. Something about unfinished things always unsettled her. Weapons were dangerous even when abandoned. She had seen enough in this war to know that. "You'll be glad to see these gone," Elias said, noticing her stare. "Maybe," she answered. "But I keep thinking, if something is dangerous when used, it's also dangerous when ignored." He frowned slightly, recognizing the sense in her worry, even if he didn't want to voice it. The M8s had failed too often, but they still carried real warheads and real potential. They were not harmless junk. A distant engine rumble interrupted the moment. At first it was faint, blending with the wind. But the sound grew heavier, more distinct, deep, grinding, mechanical. Soldiers paused in their tasks, turning their heads toward the woods. A corporal climbed onto a broken wall for a better look. Elias froze. He knew that sound instantly. "Tank," he said, voice low. The tension snapped across the yard like a pulled wire. Officers shouted to take positions, but no one was ready. The anti-tank gun near the road was still covered. Ammunition lay in crates. Most rifles wouldn't matter against armor. Lena felt her chest tighten as the engine noise grew louder. The memory of soldiers storming her village flashed through her mind. Boots shouting, the slam of doors, her mother's voice telling her to hide. Her breathing sped up, but she forced her hands to stay steady. The Panzer IV burst from the tree line, tearing through branches and underbrush. Its hull scraped against fallen logs, its turret rotating toward the camp with slow, terrifying confidence. Soldiers scattered, ducking behind walls, crates, anything that could shield them from the first shot. The first shell hit near the tents, throwing dirt and debris into the air. Men hit the ground hard. Someone screamed for the anti-tank crew, but they were too far away and completely unprepared. Elias grabbed Lena instinctively and pulled her behind a half-destroyed stone wall. Dust rained down on them as a second shell hit the field, closer this time. "We need to move the wounded," she shouted over the ringing in her ears. "We'll all be wounded if we don't stop that thing," Elias replied, scanning the yard. His eyes landed on the only object within reach that could pierce armor, even if everyone believed it couldn't. The crate of M8 rockets. "No," Lena said under her breath, understanding his intent before he even moved. "Elias, those things fail. So do we if we do nothing," he answered sharply, and then he ran. The ground shook with another explosion. Lena didn't think. She went after him. If he was going to fire one of those unstable rockets, he needed someone steady enough to help with the parts. She refused to watch him face something like that alone. Elias reached the pallet and tore off the tarp. He grabbed a launcher, checking the tube for cracks. Lena arrived a second later, breath shaking, but her movements controlled. "Which one?" he asked. She pointed quickly. "This one. Fuse looks intact." Her voice was tight, but focused. Elias locked the rocket into place, his hands moving faster than his fear. The tank was closing the distance, its tracks crushing debris, its engine roaring louder. "Behind the wall," he said. "We'll only get one shot." They ran, dove behind the same stone cover, and Elias braced the launcher on the uneven surface. Lena crouched beside him, reading the faded markings again to confirm the fuse setting. Her fingers touched his shoulder, not for comfort, but to steady him. The Panzer's turret swung toward their position. Elias exhaled once. It was a long, controlled breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next few seconds decide everything. "Ready," he said. Lena nodded. "Do it." He fired. The M8 shot from the tube with a hard jolt that pushed Elias backward. Lena held her breath as the rocket streaked toward the tank, its flight wobbling slightly, but staying on course. It slammed into the Panzer's side plate and detonated with a violent burst of fire and metal. The explosion ripped through the armor. The tank shuddered, then belched a plume of smoke. Its turret froze. Flames licked through the hatch. It stopped moving entirely. The shockwave hit the wall, showering Elias and Lena with dust and small stones. They ducked instinctively, shielding their heads. When the ringing in their ears slowly faded, they realized the battlefield had gone strangely quiet. The Panzer was burning. The German infantry fled back into the woods, scattered and leaderless. Lena slowly lifted her head. Her pulse hammered her throat. Elias was beside her, chest rising and falling, his hand still gripping the empty launcher. She reached out and touched his arm. He looked at her, and in that moment, without saying anything, both understood that what happened wasn't luck or coincidence. It was survival and trust. Men rushed across the yard shouting for medics, gathering weapons and checking damage, but for a few seconds, the world shrank to just the two of them sitting in the dust. Lena realized she wasn't trembling anymore. Elias realized he wasn't thinking about the tank that killed his friend for the first time in months. And neither of them noticed yet how this moment would pull them into each other's lives more deeply than either expected. Smoke lingered over the camp long after the Panzer IV stopped burning. Soldiers moved quickly through the ruined yard, shouting orders, carrying stretchers, sorting weapons, and searching for anyone still hurt or missing. The explosion had blown out part of the barn wall, shattered lantern glass, and left a deep crater near the tents. The ground was littered with debris, splintered crates, torn cloth, fragments of metal, and the air carried a sharp mix of fuel, dust, and scorched rubber. Lena stood beside Elias as medics ran past them. For a moment, neither spoke. Their ears still rang from the blast, and their bodies shook from the adrenaline that was only now beginning to fade. When Lena finally found her voice, it came out tight and soft. "Are you hurt?" He wiped dust from his face and checked his arms and legs. "Nothing serious." He looked at her. "You?" She shook her head, though her hands trembled visibly. Elias noticed and stepped a little closer, not touching her, but offering the kind of steady presence she could lean toward if she needed to. She steadied her breathing, grounding herself in the fact that they were alive. Officers approached, barking questions before either of them could fully recover. Lieutenant Harris pointed at Elias. "You fired a band rocket. I need an explanation right now." Elias was still catching his breath, but he answered evenly. It was the only weapon within reach that could stop a tank. Anti-tank gun wasn't loaded. "No time." Harris turned to Lena. "You were with him? Did you assist?" Lena straightened despite her exhaustion. Corporal Ward acted because the camp had no defense ready. He would have been killed otherwise, along with half the unit. "I confirmed the markings and helped load the rocket." Her voice did not shake. Somewhere between the explosion and now, her fear had turned into a cold, sharp clarity. The lieutenant glanced at the burning Panzer, then back at them. Behind him, several soldiers whispered among themselves, astonishment, disbelief, reluctant admiration. Only hours ago, they mocked the M8 as scrap metal. Now it had saved them. "I'll be writing a full report," Harris said. "Both of you stay available for questioning." He walked off, leaving them in the settling dust. As the adrenaline drained from their bodies, the weight of what happened slowly pressed down. Lena's knees gave slightly, and Elias reached out just in time, steadying her. She didn't pull away. He guided her to a half-collapsed wall and helped her sit. "I shouldn't have followed you," she said quietly, staring at her dust-covered hands. "I should have stayed back." "You did exactly what needed to be done," he replied. She shook her head once. "I wasn't brave. I just didn't want you to die." His breath caught for a moment, not from shock but from recognition. He had felt the same when he grabbed her behind the wall earlier when a shell hit near her. He didn't say it aloud, but the truth was clear between them. A medic approached and checked Elias's head, cleaning a thin cut along his hairline. Lena watched with silent concern until the medic left again to treat others. She then dipped a cloth in a bucket of cold water and gently wiped dust from Elias's cheek. He didn't resist. He closed his eyes briefly at the touch, not in discomfort, but in relief. It had been a long time since anyone tended to him with such care. Around them, the camp reorganized into a controlled frenzy. Wounded men were carried into a shelter. A smaller squad examined the destroyed tank to ensure there were no surviving crew. Officers prepared new defensive positions in case German infantry returned. For the first time since arriving, Lena felt the soldiers looking at her without suspicion. Some nodded as they passed, acknowledging her role without needing to speak it aloud. But not everyone accepted the event quietly. Later, an investigating officer from a nearby command outpost arrived, demanding detailed statements. He questioned Elias first. "You knowingly used a banned weapon," the officer said, flipping through his notebook. "Why?" Elias answered clearly, evenly. "Because nothing else would have stopped the tank in time. I made the choice. I accept responsibility." Then the officer turned to Lena. "What made you assist?" Lena's eyes met his without hesitation. "I saw that he had one chance to save lives. I knew the weapon. I knew how to read the markings fast. And I refused to let him die alone." Her answer left the officer momentarily silent. He made a few notes, but did not challenge her reasoning. Her composure under questioning only increased the respect she had unintentionally earned. By late afternoon, the chaos settled into a tired calm. Smoke rose gently from the Panzer's wreck. The camp felt strangely quiet, as if everyone was waiting for the next order that hadn't yet come. The sky turned a muted orange as the sun dropped toward the broken rooftops. Elias found Lena sitting on the steps of a ruined house, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. Her hands were clasped together, and her expression carried a fatigue deeper than physical exhaustion, something shaped by years of loss, fear, and forced control. He sat beside her without a word. For several minutes, they watched the horizon, the quiet broken only by the distant thump of artillery far away. "You were right," he said finally, "about the German movements in the woods." Lena nodded slowly. "I wish I hadn't been." "You saved lives today," he added. "So did you," she said. He let the words settle in the cold air. After a moment, she spoke again, softer this time. "When the tank appeared, I remembered the night my village was taken. I could hear the same engines, same shouting. I thought I was going to freeze." "But you didn't," Elias said gently. "No," she whispered, "because you didn't." Elias's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the heavy awareness of what her words meant. He looked at the ground, trying to steady his thoughts. For months he had lived with the guilt of surviving while his friend didn't. Today, for the first time, he felt that survival might have meant something. As the last light faded, a cold wind swept through the ruins. Lena pulled her coat closer. Without overthinking it, Elias shifted his blanket from his shoulder and draped it around her. She looked at him, surprised but grateful. She leaned slightly toward him, and he didn't move away. For the first time since arriving at the camp, Lena felt a sense of safety that did not come from walls or soldiers or orders, but from the simple, steady presence of Elias sitting beside her. And for the first time since leaving the front, Elias felt the heavy noise inside his mind ease into something quieter. The camp continued its evening routine in the background, but the two of them sat there, sharing warmth, silence, and the fragile realization that neither of them wanted to face the rest of this war alone. Unspoken questions that lingered from earlier: why Elias was transferred, why Lena reacted so strongly to engines, how much trauma each of them carried, had now found clear answers through their actions, not through speeches. The bond forming between them was no longer subtle. It was steady, unmistakable, and stronger than either had expected when the day began. By the next morning, the camp had shifted from chaos to quiet repair. Smoke no longer rose from the Panzer IV's wreck, and the smell of burning fuel had faded into the cold air. Soldiers moved with tired discipline, patching tents, rebuilding makeshift barricades, checking the wounded. The shock of yesterday's attack still lingered in everyone's expressions, but life in the unit carried on because it had to. Lena woke before sunrise, her sleep shallow but free from the nightmares she had expected. She stepped outside the hut, wrapped in her coat, and found Elias already awake. He stood near the destroyed tank, hands in his pockets, staring at the charred metal as if trying to make sense of it. She approached quietly, her boots crunching lightly on the frosty ground. "Couldn't sleep?" "Not much," he said. "Too many things in my head." She understood. The explosion, the decisions they made, the risks they took. It all settled differently once the adrenaline faded. Before they could speak further, Lieutenant Harris called them to the command hut. The investigating officer from the day before sat behind a cluttered desk, now holding a finalized report. "I won't waste time," the officer said. Headquarters reviewed everything. Corporal Ward's actions were justified under emergency conditions. The use of the banned M8 rocket will be reported as a necessary decision during an unplanned armored breach. No punishment. Elias breathed out slowly, a tension releasing from his shoulders. The officer continued, turning to Lena. "Interpreter Hartmann, your testimony and assistance were accurate and essential. Command acknowledges your role in preventing further casualties." Lena nodded respectfully, though emotion flickered briefly in her eyes. Relief mixed with something deeper, something personal. The officer closed the file. "The unit is relocating within the next 48 hours. You'll both receive new assignments." After he dismissed them, Lena and Elias stepped back into the cold morning air. For a moment, neither spoke. Both wondered the same thing. Would they be separated now that the immediate danger had passed? They didn't voice their concern, but the silence between them carried the weight of it. Later, Lena received a message from another Allied office. Two surviving relatives, an aunt and a cousin, had been located in a nearby Allied-controlled city. The confirmation hit her harder than she expected. She leaned against the wall of the command hut and closed her eyes, letting the news sink in. It was a connection to a life she thought had been completely shattered. Elias found her minutes later, sensing something had changed. "You all right?" She handed him the small paper. "My family, part of them survived." Elias studied her face, seeing the tremble in her breath. Not from fear this time, but a fragile kind of hope. "That's good news," he said softly. "It is," she replied, but her voice carried conflicting emotions. "I don't know what to do next." He understood that, too. Good news in war often felt complicated and heavy. As midday approached, orders arrived confirming their new assignments. The unit would move to a safer rear area town where supply and repair operations were being reorganized. Lena was asked to continue working as an interpreter for logistics and administration. Elias was given a choice: return to the frontline armored divisions or remain in ordnance and training. He sat for a long time with the paper in his hands. The idea of facing tanks again made his stomach tighten. The memory of Tom's death still lived inside him. He knew that returning would tear open everything he had barely managed to bury. He found Lena near the well behind the barn, filling a canteen. She turned as he approached, noticing the form in his hand. "You got your orders?" she asked. Choice of assignments, he replied, his voice low. I can go back to the front or stay in support. What do you want? She asked gently. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and the answer rose with a clarity he couldn't ignore. I don't want to go back to armored combat. Not after everything. And I don't want to be sent somewhere far from here. Lena blinked at that last part, her breath catching slightly. She didn't hide the warmth that stirred in her. Then stay, she said. There's no shame in choosing a place where you can breathe. And you, he asked, will you stay with the unit? Or go find your family? I'll find them, she said honestly. But not today. Not until the next duty transfer. Not until I know where I'm going. She hesitated, then added softly, and I don't want to leave without knowing what comes next with us. It was the first time either of them had spoken openly about the bond that had grown between them. The moment was not dramatic, not overly emotional, just honest and grounded. Two people who had seen death too closely to waste time pretending they felt nothing. The next day, the unit finished packing. Trucks lined the road, engines rumbling steadily, ready to move out. Soldiers climbed aboard with blankets and rifles, while officers checked manifests and maps. The test yard, once chaotic and broken, now stood nearly empty. Elias and Lena boarded the same transport truck. She sat beside him on a wooden bench, their shoulders touching. Their hands brushed once, then stayed together without needing to hide it. As the truck started moving, the ruined village faded behind them. The cold wind swept into the back of the vehicle, pulling at Lena's hair. She leaned slightly against Elias, and he steadied her with a quiet, natural instinct that felt like something more permanent than chance. Ahead lay a rear area town, damaged but safe enough for rebuilding, and close enough to where her surviving family lived. Elias would help train new ordnance recruits there, far from the front lines that had carved so deeply into him. Lena would work with logistics, helping rebuild communications and civilian administration. Their futures were no longer uncertain. The final scene followed them as they stepped off the truck hours later, entering a town full of broken windows, half-repaired streets, and people trying to return to ordinary life. It wasn't peaceful, not yet, but it was a place where recovery could begin. Elias carried his pack on one shoulder. Lena walked beside him with her papers held close, and the two of them moved through the street with a shared direction, not two separate ones. There were no more lurking dangers, no unresolved questions. Their mission had changed, no longer survival, but living. Their steps matched without effort, and when Lena reached for his hand, Elias took it firmly, without hesitation. The war was still out there, but for the first time since it began, both of them had someone to walk with, and a future they could finally see.